Welcome to another episode of Spiritually Powered Horsemanship, where Cindy and Laura, two very different women from two very different backgrounds, share how they are alchemizing hearts and horses for a deeper connection with life. One of our deepest intentions on this podcast is to keep it real, because in our horsemanship journeys, there's no black and white. Nothing is for sure, and anything can change at a given moment. So in that, we're always going to share with you our intention for an episode, but Cindy and I are pretty good at calling each other forward and exploring something out of left field when we see that that person needs that support. And we're going to take you along on that journey. So if it happens and we take a right turn and end up somewhere else, we trust that it was meant to be. As you listen to this episode, if you're finding yourself having an aha, a new awareness, or just really enjoying the conversation, please leave us a 5-star review on wherever you're listening to us. This is the best thing that you can do to help us get this podcast into the ears of more passionate horse people. So in our last episode, we talked a lot about energy and how we can move energy around with our horses and what that looks and feels like. And we realized in the recording of that episode that we want to get really deep into the release, recognizing the release, knowing what it means, knowing what to do when you see your horse release, and knowing what to do when you see your horse needing to release but not letting it out. This is really step one of teaching your horse to regulate their energy and their emotions. When you learn to work with the release with your horse, you open up tons of doors for you guys to be able to navigate new things spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, all of it in a super empowered way.
I really am excited to talk about this subject. It's taken me a few years to learn about it, but now I kind of geek out on it. And so I'm going to do my best to describe what I have learned, the releases and what it means to me and how I can see it playing out in the work that I do with my horses and with clients' horses. I want to plant this seed because this is a powerful truth about horses and about engaging with horses. And if you can hear this and think about it and learn about it and hear it again, and the more that you learn it, the deeper it goes, and the more that it expands, and then the deeper it goes. It's one of those kind of things. It's kind of like martial arts or spirituality. The
Or
more we
horsemanship.
know, or horsemanship, yes. The more we know, the more we realize we don't know. But anyway, what I want to plant the seed to start this out with is pressure motivates, but it's the release that teaches. And even though what we're about to talk about is the physical releasing that our horses are demonstrating, pressure motivates our horses to make a change, to do something we want them to do. Pressure motivates them to react or respond, meaning we're walking by the hay covered by a tarp and the wind blows, and that's pressure on the horses' sensory awareness, all of them. And the horse runs away from that or spooks. And as they get away, that's when the release comes. So the pressure motivates, but it's the release that teaches them. That's why when horses rear back and break away from being tied or break away from your hands, That's the pressure. They're pulling back. When they get the release, the halter snaps, they break out of your hand and they run and eat grass. That's the release. And that's teaching that when you get worried and scared and you pull against pressure and you get that release, you get to run and eat grass. So that pressure motivates, release teaches. That's good for you. That's important in what we're going to talk about. So what is releasing? This is where I get to geek out on you guys. We're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. And what I love about the autonomic nervous system is it is the same in humans as it is in horses. So there's the sympathetic nervous system and there's the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system in a horse is that fight or flight. It's when their head comes up above their withers. In that space, they're releasing two chemicals, adrenaline and cortisol. And when they're releasing those two chemicals, there's some interesting things that happen to them physiologically, to them physically in their body. When a horse is in sympathetic nervous system, they're releasing adrenaline and cortisol. The blood supply stops flowing equally throughout the body and goes not only, they're still getting blood supplied to these vital organs, you guys, but most of the blood and oxygen goes to the three parts of their body that they need to survive whatever's put them in their sympathetic nervous system, also known as the reptilian part of the brain. It's their heart, their lungs, and their muscles, because that's what they need to get away from whatever is got them in that state, that hyper sympathetic nervous system state. Some will freeze, and if you startle a frozen horse, then they flee, or most horses will just take flight. When they have gotten away from that stimulus, that threat, all prey animals do this, and it's very cool to witness when you know what you're seeing. When they have gotten away from the stimulus, their head will start to drop below their withers. And as that's happening, their autonomic nervous system is going from sympathetic nervous system to parasympathetic nervous system. God made prey animals graze on the ground for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
When they're down grazing, head below their withers, below their shoulders, they're now releasing endorphins and serotonin. Now, there's another thing that happened. Okay, sorry, I'll come back to that. So when they're in that state, now their blood supply and oxygen is returning to the entire body, all of their organs, their brain. So when they're in that fight or flight, that sympathetic nervous system, they're reactive. They are not thinking. They can't. They're not getting enough oxygen or blood up there to think. They're in reaction mode. But as they start to self-regulate back into that parasympathetic, that's when the blood supply comes back. That's when the brain checks back in. That's when they can think and they can start to relax their muscles. They can start taking deeper breaths instead of that gotta run. And you will often see them start to do rapid blinking.
Mm-hmm.
You'll also see them start to lick and chew. Now, there's a lot of trainers out there, natural horsemanship trainers, a lot of just trainers will say when they're blinking, they're thinking, and that is a yes. Versus when they have that fixed stare, they're not thinking. They're either gone into themselves, getting ready to go fight or flight, or they're staring at something in the distance that they heard or see that we didn't.
Yep.
So the blinking and the licking and the chewing is, yes, they're thinking, but this is what's really happening, you guys. When they're in the sympathetic nervous system and the blood supply and the oxygen stops going to everything but those three, what were they again? Muscle, heart, and lungs. When it all starts coming back, well, when it's there, their salivary glands stop working. So they quite literally get cotton mouth. They're not blinking, so their eyes have started to dry out. When they get back down into the parasympathetic nervous system, the salivary glands come back on. So now they're getting rid of that cotton mouth and they're blinking to lubricate their eyes again. And this is a autonomic nervous system response. They're not like, oh, my eyes are dry, I gotta blink. And oh, my mouth is dry, I gotta lick and chew. But when you see the licking and the chewing and you see the blinking, you know that your horse is returning back to that parasympathetic nervous system, not the sympathetic. So that's good to know, because when we're teaching our horses, and this is a sad thing that most trainers that don't understand the physiology of horses and the nervous system, and I was guilty until I became a geek on this stuff. Thank you, Martin Black and Stephen Peters, for your evidence-based horsemanship book. Shameless plug.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's where I learned this stuff and now I can't get enough of it. But most trainers and most people who work with horses do not understand this. And so they teach their horses up in that sympathetic nervous system and they keep them there by too much, too much, too much, too fast, too consistent. Keep it going. Oh, this was really hard. Great. You got it. Now do it again, do it again, do it again, do it again. Okay, now we're going to go do this. Now do it again, do it again, do it again. And the horse never gets to think. This is an example I give my students is, have you ever worked for somebody, or have you ever had your parents or your teacher go to your bedroom, get your shoes, get your jacket, get your favorite pajamas, brush your teeth, brush your hair, get out here and do it in 5 minutes and hurry up and let's go. And you're like, well, okay, that's how we teach our horses. We don't give them a break.
I'm
They're
super guilty of doing that as a spouse. Super
we
guilty.
we have the same autonomic nervous system. We need those moments to think. So we teach our horses to be adrenaline junkies because we don't understand their autonomic nervous system and how they learn, and that they actually need, I call it the power in the pause. I actually have a whole article written on the power in the pause. You're going to teach your horse so much deeper and better and meaningful and take less time things if you will recognize that sympathetic, they need to drop into the parasympathetic when they got it right. Pressure motivates, they're in the sympathetic. Yes, great job. Take the pressure off, the release, and they drop into the parasympathetic, and you pause and you breathe deeply and just be there with them, which we are not. We suck at patience. So
Yep.
just hurry it up, and waiting is really hard for us. But if we can do that, You have a horse that has learned a lesson because they're in that pause, in that time of a release. They are actually laying down new neural pathways, which are highways through our nervous system from our body to our brain. They're learning new neural pathways. And if we don't pause in between there and let them release, they're not having the opportunity to lay down new neural pathways. And so we're like, God, are they ever going to learn it?
Yep.
And it's because we're not taking enough time. So I've said a lot there. And what I want to do is let Laura talk a little bit about some of the ways that she recognizes when horses are releasing and what that looks like and what we can look for.
Yeah, Cindy, while you were talking, I realized I wanted to unpack the freeze moment a little bit more because a lot of times we're taught and we have almost an intuitive thought of, "Ooh, I got to get their feet moving again." Because, first comes the freeze and then comes the rear and the buck and the bolt. And so I just got to get them through it, is the less spiritually empowered thought process. And then you rush, as you were just saying, through the thing. And it's fear-based of, shit, my horse is going to do something super dangerous because they're frozen. And if you realize, no, okay, so good example is the property next to the one where MJ lives. The guy who lives there is a veteran with very severe PTSD, and sadly, he self-medicates with alcohol, and he's very unpredictable, and he has unpredictable energy. And so MJ always gets a little fussy going by that part of the property on the trail. And I know that she needs to lay eyes on him when she can feel that he's out, and then she'll feel safe. So she'll take a pause. But I'm feeling, are you taking a pause to look around, or are you stuck in a freeze? Now, because we've done it hundreds of times, she's taking a pause to look around. But even if she's stuck in a freeze, I'm not necessarily wanting her to walk by that property without looking twice at it, ever. I want her to walk by that property staying in her thinking mind. So getting the horse out of the freeze can be something as gentle as wiggling the rein, getting them to just take one step underneath, just making a tiny adjustment where they're still not necessarily moving forward freely or doing the thing that you asked them to do, but you're inviting them back into their thinking mind. And then that pause, that moment, get them back into the thinking mind, and then address the scary thing. And when you implement that process, your horse's bravery and their trust in you just skyrockets astoundingly. MJ loves obstacles, and we're very lucky to live around a lot of different places where we can go. And there is not an obstacle, we have not met an obstacle that we cannot get through on the ground because of this process.
That's a great example. Yeah.
So yeah, you don't have to, like, next time you find your horse in a freeze, just look for the head drop or the blinking. Wait on that and then let them go through it.
Yeah.
The more you wait on it, the more they're gonna seek it on their own. Yesterday it was a beautiful sunny day at the barn, but it was really windy. And we have all these, we've kind of outgrown our tack room. So we have all these like plastic outdoor sheds that we're building around the tack room to add more space for saddles and stuff. And one of the gals had come and left her door ajar. And so MJ is like falling asleep while I'm grooming her, and the wind blows and that door slammed back. And it jolted her out of her sleepy state. She jumped up in the air. Ugh. And then as soon as her eyes locked on that swinging door, she was licking and chewing almost before her feet touched the ground. Like, oh, just the shed. Because we've done so much work on this, she can recognize what she perceives as a danger or not and process like that.
You're making me think of it's off topic, but it's not. Is what's scary to one is not scary to another.
Yeah.
Like if
Yeah.
Harry and I joined Laura and MJ at an obstacle course event, we would be having two completely different experiences.
Yes.
My horse would be in sympathetic nervous system the great deal of the time, and hers would be in the parasympathetic nervous system. And for me to say, "Oh, Harry, you're being so stupid. Look at MJ." That's me dishonoring my horse and undermining the trust. And that's what creates PTSD in
Absolutely.
horses and
Yeah.
in humans. For Laura and I to go to a ghost house, and I've got PTSD from a ghost house, and her going, "Come on, Cindy, I'm just going to show you. Oh, don't be scared. That's silly. That's stupid. Don't
Right.
be
I'm showing it to you. Therefore, why are you still scared of
Come
it?
with
That
me.
is,
I'll hold your hand. We'll be fine." And something jumps out and I freak out. And she goes, "Cindy, that's stupid. Don't look. It's just this. It's nothing." She's undermining my trust in her because she's not honoring. Now, I don't want her to go, "Oh, it's okay. Okay, no, 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 no." I don't want her to be babied, nor do I want to baby my horse. But to honor the fact that the horse is frozen. And like Laura said, don't, "Oh, it's okay. It's okay. All right. We won't go there." No, that's as wrong as just, "Oh, it's just a stupid this. Just go, just go. Kick, kick, kick." That's wrong too. I like to take nice deep breaths, and I teach my horses on the ground to stop, I rub them to a stop. And I always rub them on either side of their shoulders, of their withers. Because when I'm in the saddle and they start getting bothered, I go right into that same rubbing motion, which we have already trained is calming. Now, Laura and I are both acupressure trained. We know the meridians. We know that there are acupressure points on those withers that are sedating. And that's why when you watch horses grooming each other, they groom those withers. So that's a trick. But yeah, I'm glad that you came back to the freeze. So when our horse releases, Laura, what are you seeing?
one that happens during movement that we didn't talk about. That's a good one. A big breathe out where their lips go
Yeah.
together. That's a huge one. That they will often do while they're still walking around. You go through something on the trail where all the horses booger, and then 2 minutes later it's over, they all start blowing out. And when I ask MJ or any horse that I'm riding to stop, I
Mm-hmm.
breathe out my stops and sit really deep. And so I'm doing that big breath and inviting them to do the same, which we're doing the exact same thing in two different ways with our horses. When MJ is gonna do a big one, it starts with a wrinkly eyeball, and then the eyes roll back and the head, and then the yawns start going, and the lower jaw's moving independently of the upper jaw, and the tongue's hanging out, I mean, they can go as far as laying down and rolling,
Mm-hmm.
just depending on how big it is that you're moving and what it is that you're moving.
Huge yawning,
Huge.
lots and
Yep.
lots of yawning.
Yep. And sometimes if they've been holding lots of pressure and just holding everything in, a big poop is a release.
Yep. And urinating,
Yeah.
depending on how much they were pushed into that sympathetic. I teach my clients to read their horse's face, read their horse.
Yeah.
That goes back to our episode of awareness, personal awareness, horse awareness, environment awareness. It's our job as the leader to master all three.
Yeah.
And watching your horse and learning to read their body language, their facial language, is going to help you understand where they are. They might be in the sympathetic nervous system, but they're like excited and, looking off into the distance, and they're totally connected and ready to go with you. They're in reactive mode, but they are with you.
Yes.
Versus when they are in that fight or flight, scared to death, there's a whole different presentation of it. And so we were talking before we started the podcast on how to learn to know what is your horse's normal relaxed face look like. Soft floppy ears, almond-shaped eyes, no tension in the muzzle, no tendon protruding down the sides of their face that connect, close to their lips, no tension in their neck.
Just moving with ease. Like, when MJ's operating off of feel and going both directions with no problem and stopping when I stop, when we're operating and I don't have to think about giving her direction, she's just reading me completely. I know that she's in tune and she's relaxed.
Yeah. And that can be in the saddle or on the ground.
Yes, absolutely.
When you're walking a flying kite,
They're
you're in sympathetic nervous, they're in
they
sympathetic
need to release.
and you're most likely there with them.
Yes.
Unless you've done a lot of self-awareness work and a lot of that breathing down into your power center below your belly button.
Yes.
You're in sympathetic as well. But one of the fascinating things about when you start tuning into this stuff and you've worked with your horse on mastering something, and it could be as simple as putting the front feet on the trailer, putting their front feet on the bridge, walking into the wash rack, stepping over the puddle, just things. And then you recognize it was difficult and you give them that pause. This is where the patience come in, because you cannot predict. I can't tell you within 2 minutes your horse will release.
No.
Within 10 minutes your horse will release.
Yeah.
Because you don't know. That's like predicting what we're going to do. But this is what I witness, and this is what I share with my clients as it's happening. Is when they've learned something and you've appropriately taken the pressure off, and you're applying the release, which means you're just hanging with them, holding the space. Do not pet them and tell them they were a good horse. You're going to snap them out of that. Just like, you see somebody and they're sitting there peacefully and they're looking off in the distance and they don't see you coming, and you go up and you go, "Hey, Laura," and she's like, "Oh, hi."
Yeah.
That's the same as when you give your horse the release and they're in that processing, going from sympathetic to parasympathetic. Don't touch them. Just be with your horse. This is self-control stuff, you guys. What you're going to see is you'll see the rapid blinking.
Mm-hmm.
Then you'll see it kind of slow down and get more rhythmic. Then you'll see their breathing change. You can watch their nostrils. Then you will see their lips, their upper lip, start to do little twitching.
Twitches, yeah.
Little tiny, and you got to watch for it. Little tiny twitching. And then the blinking will start slowing down at that time, and they'll almost start to look like they're going to fall asleep or they're on sedation. And then when you see those lips, that upper lip trembling a little bit, then comes the lick and the chew. And it's not done yet. Because then they may pause and do it all over again, or they may pause and go into the big yawn Laura was talking about, where, it is like their nose is in the air and their mouth's wide open and their lower jaw's going left and the upper jaw's going right. And you'll sometimes get that eye popping back in the back of the head, which is a weird thing to see. And I have literally been doing this long enough that I will not sit, I will stand and talk to my client about what did you just see? What did you just learn from that? So I'm taking my client's attention off of the horse. And I have literally talked to them for 10 minutes before that horse actually released. And every time I witness that, my heart sings and I praise myself for having the patience
To
and
stop the session.
yep, to
Yeah.
trust the process and let them have their moment. What about you? How have you seen that play out?
Yeah, it's really in the more you do it, the quicker it will come. But when you're starting out, you have to be so patient with it. And when you're really up against something that's new and hard, you have to be so patient with it. Um, so we haven't quite gotten into this yet, but I'm going to bring us into it now as we've been talking about all these releases from a behavioral and mental standpoint, but they can also come from stored trauma and emotion in the body, and that can be from emotional experiences or physical injury where energy gets blocked. You or I have it too. I have a degenerative discs at L3 and L4, and I get tons of blocked energy around that area of my spine and the muscles because I'm constantly guarding that part of my body to not have a back episode. In a weird twist of fate where I'm missing bone in my back, MJ has extra bone in her back. And she's the same way. And that is something that her releases take a long time physically on that. Just that, I do the Reiki exercise that we talked about in our last episode, the energy exercise. I put my hands on her back. And as long as she's not walking away, I know she wants me to still be there. And I can stand there for 10 or 15 minutes with seemingly nothing happening. And then it comes and they're huge releases. And oh, thank goodness, I've been wanting to let that go. And you have to have the patience with yourself to trust that it's going to come. Before I had the relationship with MJ that I have now, I had pulled her out of a rescue. She'd bumped through a couple homes. She'd never had a really, really deep and trusting relationship with a person before. She was born at the rescue and always treated very well, but she never had a person, and she's pretty guarded. She's not going to show you her heart the first time you meet her. That's just who she is. And so I would notice we would go through a whole training session, and that was 5 years ago, and I didn't have the awareness to stop and wait for the pause. So I would be curious to go back and see if it was different if I did. But I would absolutely notice when I put her back and walked away, she'd stand there and release over and over and over again for 5, 10 minutes, just yawning, and she wasn't ready to let that go in my presence. I think I could have facilitated better and gotten there sooner. But depending on what your horse has been through from a physical, spiritual, emotional, mental standpoint,
Or environmental
environmental,
humans.
yep, or environmental in the pasture. If your horse is low man on the totem pole, they
Mm.
might not be as comfortable as letting go of stuff in the pasture as they are out with you. They might be carrying stuff that went on in the pasture out with you, and you might see huge benefits of sitting with that possibility and inviting stuck energy to flow out before you start your session with them.
And that's where simple groundwork just to begin with can help because you're just allowing them to move their feet and show you where they're at.
Yeah.
And in doing that, you're just connecting with our open hearts. So if they did have something in there happen, just by simple groundworks, a few circles, trots, walks, move the hindquarters, and pause, you may just see them go "Ah," and
Yeah,
release.
and just pose the question to them. I mean, gosh, Cindy's the animal communicator, not me, but I just Ask MJ with my heart. What's been going on in the pasture? And sometimes she engages in that conversation, and sometimes she's like, oh, doesn't matter. But if I feel her drop in closer to me and lean in to me just posing that question, we sit with it for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing there's an energetic frequency to every thought that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you just give yourself a minute to have the thought in your horse's presence and you know how to read them, you can see their response.
And I believe that any of us that have an open heart around horses, which I think most of our listeners here do, they have horses because they make them feel better. They make time stand still. They just, we just feel so alive when we're with them. We intuitively know more than I think intellectually we will allow ourselves to acknowledge and believe.
Yes.
Because I watch women at different places I go to, and the conversations they're having or just the interaction that's going on, and I'm watching the horse and I'm like, I wonder how long it's going to take her to notice that that horse is trying to say something to her. And some will immediately respond, and others are totally oblivious. And that goes back to that awareness.
Yeah.
It begins with us. I'm also learning from as much time that I'm spending diving in, geeking out on the autonomic nervous system. There's a great deal of humanity that is running 80 to 90% of the time in the sympathetic nervous system, and they become adrenaline junkies.
Absolutely.
And we didn't talk about the dopamine in that whole process. Dopamine is the chemical that's addictive. We
Yep.
eat chocolate, we release dopamine, we want more. Addictions are because what we're doing is giving us a dopamine hit, and we want that feel good all the time. And horses become dopamine junkies too. So these horses that are in high level training facilities and are in box stall paddocks until they go out and have intense training, and then they're put back away, and they develop those displaced behaviors like cribbing and weaving and pacing. I've seen some that just stick their tongue out and suck on their tongue like it's a pacifier. That's so disturbing and so heartbreaking. But what's happening is they're releasing endorphins and dopamine. And that's why those habits are nearly impossible. Now, I'm not saying totally, I'm saying nearly
Yep.
impossible to interrupt because of that dopamine addiction. So a horse can get a dopamine hit in the sympathetic nervous system, and they can get a dopamine hit in the parasympathetic. And for those of us who have devoted their lives to being the best they can be for horses, I'm damn careful to make sure I'm not giving a horse a dopamine hit in the sympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
And what that means is you apply pressure, they're in that sympathetic, they're trying to figure out how to get that pressure to stop, and they do the right thing, and you stop that particular pressure, but then you jump into a new lesson. It's not as high intense pressure yet because you're showing them what that new lesson is. Well, that little pause, that little release, pressure motivates, release teaches, that little release, but they're still in the sympathetic. It's that release that releases that dopamine hit. So now they start looking for that dopamine hit in the sympathetic nervous system. And now you have a horse that's anxious, flighty, more go than whoa, lack of confidence. Why? does a horse who spends most of its time in sympathetic nervous system have a lack of confidence?
Because they never complete the thought, they never complete the release.
They never get exactly right. They never get to get out of reactionary
Yep.
mode, get a blood flow back to their brain and all of their body so that they can respond.
And whatever's stuck, if we're going back to the energetic world, never fully leaves.
Yep. Yep. So when I learned about all of this releasing, and what was really going on behind the scenes, aka inside, it turned my program around almost 360. And because Laura and I are both coaches, Laura is a business coach. I am a horsemanship and transformational coach. We care as much about what's going on in the human as we do, for me, the animal,
Yeah.
for Laura, the business,
Yeah.
right? Because they have a relationship with their business, like horse, like we have a relationship with our horse, right? We have a relationship to money.
Yep.
So when my client thinks about doing things with their horses, does that put them in their sympathetic nervous system or their parasympathetic? It's a little of both, often the sympathetic, because they're not taking deep breaths. Short, shallow breaths put you in your sympathetic nervous system. When Laura's clients think about growing their business, or
Stepping out on
even
stage, doing something terrifying. Yeah. Yeah.
anything business related that they're not comfortable doing, they're in their sympathetic nervous system. So the first thing Laura does, like she does with MJ or anybody at the barn that's stuck in a situation with their horse, the first place we go is to the person.
Yeah.
We've got to get you breathing. We've got to get you down in that power center and getting oxygen and blood to all of your body. So you're out of reactive mode and in responsive mode so that you can clearly address whatever's in front of you that you're trying to achieve.
I mean, your ticket to a life that is enjoyable is a regulated nervous system,
Nervous system,
no
yes.
matter what you're doing. And that's what we're talking about here is we're talking about step one of regulating your nervous system.
And
And
your horse.
I found I horses taught me how to regulate my nervous system because I realized I was never going to make progress with these really high intensity Arabs that I was working with if I didn't become their safe space. And when you learn how to regulate your nervous system, no matter what's going on around you, you become the safe space for all the living beings in the vicinity. And I took that to business, but it's the same thing. And so when we're saying give your horse the pause, I'm not standing there picking my nose when my horse is, when I'm giving her the pause. I'm tuning in with me and I'm allowing, making sure my nervous system is regulated. And if it's not, I'm taking my belly breaths, focusing on my energy centers. And, we talked in a previous episode about how you're constantly creating a feedback loop. When you learn how to regulate your nervous system, you become the start of an incredibly powerful feedback loop.
That we're coming up on kind of on our time, but that brings me into a story that I want to share because Laura is absolutely right. I mean, we could go on for a while about how you can change your environment. You can walk into a room of 50 people, and within 15 minutes, you can change the energy in that room. You can walk into a pasture, and within 15, well, less with a pasture of horses. You can change that environment from calm, cool, symbiotic to total chaos, or you can turn it from total chaos into a harmonious experience. just based on your awareness of yourself and breathing into your body and regulating your nervous system.
Yeah.
I was working with a little horse today. He's a little Mustang, and he's got a great life. He's an awesome horse, but he hasn't had he can get into his sympathetic nervous system pretty quick. And when he does, he's flight. There's no freezing. He's gone.
Yeah.
I got the rope burns to prove it today. And so I was working with him, and when he gets confused, he wants to get fast. Okay, so there's that sympathetic flight in him. And he gets a little bit more nervous with me because I come in with a stronger leadership and I ask more of him and I accept less bad behavior from him. And so we were doing this simple weave through cones patterns, and he was wanting to get right up on top of me. And so I was asking him to move away, and that I could see him getting higher and higher in that sympathetic nervous system. His head was high and staying instead of coming down. He was checking in with me less, and I dropped my training stick. So I bent down to grab my training stick, and he looked. So I was probably 3 feet away from his shoulder, bent down to pick up my stick, stood up, and he lost his shit. Started trying to run away like I had just bit him on the butt. So I tried to hold on and obviously didn't succeed. Should have let go sooner. And he ran around frantic. And his person was just kind of looking at me and looking at him and trying to stay out of the way. And I just took the center of the arena and stood calmly and started breathing.
Yep.
And I watched him, and he ran still pretty frantic, looking for his way out, you know. And so I realized that's not enough for him. So I just backed into his path of travel until I caught his eye. And then I kind of looked at his hip and turned towards his hip, and he was still 10 feet, 15 feet away from me. And I turned and just kind of looked at his hip and threw my energy around, didn't throw it fast, turned my energy around. And that horse latched onto my eyes and came and stood right next to me.
Yep.
Lowered his head, started licking and chewing, started blinking rapidly. And so I just stood there with him for a minute and explained to the owner that one of my methods in teaching wild horses in the gentling process or teaching babies is I will randomly fall at their shoulders when I'm walking them.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you ever come off that horse, that's where you're most likely going to land. And when a horse sees that happen, it terrifies the shit out of them. And I realized that she had an accident early on in his early start where she came off him and he headed for the hills, jumped a 5-foot fence into the neighbor's horse pen. That's where she found him.
Oh.
And so I spent the next 10 or 15 minutes walking around with him and tripping and falling on the ground, tripping and falling on the ground. At one point, I fell in front of him and I hunched down in a ball and I'm like, oh, ow, 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 oh my
Yeah.
God, oh my God. And that little horse came over and stood over me with his head like, are you okay? And so I'm like, I don't think I can get up. And I started pulling on his front leg, trying to get up. And he just stood there like, I got you. I got you. And then I just stood there with him. I didn't touch him. I took my energy off of him and I talked. I just stood and talked to the person. And she was like, just looking at me like, oh my God. And pretty soon I hear you, if you're close enough and you know what you're listening for, and Laura, I am sure you know this sound,
Yeah.
you can hear that eyeball pop back. So he started popping his eyeballs and then he started licking and chewing and major, major yawning. And I just stood there with my heart wide open, didn't touch him. And then pretty soon he's coming over and he's nuzzling his nose in my armpit.
Yeah.
And I just let him. I didn't touch him and I didn't tell him no. I just opened. This is that heart and soul spiritual connection. I just had my heart as wide open as I could possibly have it. So proud of him for going from, "Ah, I'm dying, you dropped your stick and picked it up," to, "Oh my God, I got you. Okay, when you fall, I'm gonna come, I'm just gonna stand next to you and make and we're just gonna be okay."
Yeah.
That is the regulating
It
and the
is.
releasing and the whole autonomic nervous system stuff that goes on.
Yeah. Okay. Two things I want to highlight from that. One, when a horse is in fight or flight, they've gone over threshold. They're pulling back, tied. They are running without seeing. Physically, there's nothing we can do. And hopefully, you've all been taught to stand back and stay out of the way because that's all you can do. But energetically, you staying grounded. Cindy didn't jump in front of that horse. She used her energy to guide him into a stop. There is tons you can do if you are coming from a regulated place. If she was unregulated, she would have just spun him around in a 180 and he would have took off going the other direction. Same thing. I am extremely clumsy because I have ADHD and I have horrible spatial awareness. It makes for really quiet horses. Because like in the mud in the winter, I'm holding on MJ's neck for dear life as we're coming out of the pasture. But I'm not doing that from a frantic space. And this really gets into desensitization, which we should talk about in a future episode. But
Absolutely.
I'm never tiptoeing around my horse, ever, for any reason. And if, in the very beginning of training, the first time she steps on her lead rope, gets her head stuck down, I don't go, "Oh my God." I go, "Oh, you're stuck. That's okay. Take a minute." So when you're being not quiet around your horse, you don't do it in a frantic, throwy energy kind of way. You do it in a this is part of life and it's not good or bad or yes or no or green or red. It's just life kind of way.
It's just this moment, which is
Yeah.
what I live in.
Yeah.
The other thing that you brought up that is so you brought up a lot of great points there. The one I love is you don't tiptoe around your horse, but you know when to be mindful of,
Yeah.
okay, and not even that. You know how you are helpful for your horse when you learn to manage your energy.
Yes.
So when Laura's slipping and sliding and she's having a hard time, like she said, she's not in panic mode. She's just like, oh dear God, I don't want to go down in the mud. MJ, hold me. And MJ's like, all right, I got you. This isn't our first rodeo in the mud. I got you. It's not your strong suit. You sure you don't want to just hop on my back? We could probably both get out of here better.
Yes.
But when this little Mustang took off, he was dragging his rope.
Yeah.
And there were moments of him panicking, and I'm like, all right, clearly he's not drug his rope. I teach all my colts and all my wilds to drag a rope as soon as I can and to learn how to figure it out. But at one point, he was running around so much, he was bunny hopping with his hind feet.
Yeah, because it
And
was touching him a little bit and
he actually got that rope two swings around his hind legs. And
oh,
I'm standing in the middle and I'm like, I don't think I've ever seen that happen before. I wonder how he's going to work that out. That was exactly my energy. Like, and sure enough, he just moved one and then the other, like we shimmy out of our
you
pantyhose.
got it. Yeah.
You women, he just kind of one and then the other, and that rope just slipped off his leg. And it was so fun. I love this client dearly. It was so fun. She was like, I always debrief, what'd you learn? And she's like, oh my God. It's okay for a horse to drag their rope. I'm like, yes. And they need to learn that people fall. I didn't realize that it made the wreck that she had had before so much more understandable.
Yeah.
And that she said, but the biggest thing for me was anybody else I know would have been running after that horse. And all
Right.
you did was stand in the middle. And you've been telling me for a few years to stand in the middle, So yeah, we live in an energy pool.
Yep.
We can either be the quiet in the storm, or we can be part of the storm.
Yeah. So that's your challenge after listening to this episode.
Can you begin to practice the release and the pause?
In
And
your like actual work with your horse during a session.
yes,
Yeah.
anything that riding or on the ground, you struggled to get something, you applied pressure. The minute your horse does it right, stop. Sit on the horse or stand next to the horse and go into your breathing and don't touch the horse. The hardest thing I see for people, and I think it was probably me in the beginning too, was you want to go up and rub them and say, oh, good girl, good boy. Don't. Self-discipline, patience, breathing, and allow the release and the pause. And we would love to hear comments
Yeah.
on that.
On how it went. That rubbing is humans are very tactile, and rubbing a furry animal regulates your nervous system.
Yes.
So what you're doing when you're rubbing on them is you're actually possibly passing your anxiety on to them.
I love that, Laura. I had one of my horsemanship mentors say, one rub between the eyes is for them. Anything else is all about you.
Yeah.
And I was like, I catch myself sometimes wanting to do more than one. And I'm like, oh, that's my needs. But I love that you're pointing it out. That's our way of regulating our nervous system.
So if you need to buy a little section of fur and glue it to your pants, have at it. Don't do it to your horse.
Or you could be like me. I carry crystals in my
There
pocket.
you go. Yes.
Just stick your hand in your pocket and rub your crystals while you wait for your horse to release. Thank you for tuning in to this episode on our podcast. I want to remind you that we'll be here every second and fourth Tuesday of the month, following the golden rule. That's the plan, but we are always willing to be flexible. If you want to connect with either one of us, you can do so by finding me on Facebook, my Facebook group, Unbridled Reflections. And you can find Laura on Instagram. She's known as the Homestead Witch. The links to those contacts can be found in the show notes below.
Don't forget, if you learned something new today, had an aha, or walked away with a valuable nugget of awareness, you can say thanks by leaving us a review on whatever platform you're listening on.